Yep.
I guess I should put my glasses on so I look official.
Camera looks good.
All righty.
Okay. So we are now recording. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Counterpoint podcast. I'm your host, Chris Wright, and today I've brought on a guest, Bill Thompson from the Now I've Heard Everything podcast. So I'll let you introduce yourself to start off here.
Well, I was a professional radio newscaster for 45 years until I retired 2 years ago in the fall of 2018, largely due to health issues, but that's a whole nother story. But I had a very happy 45 years. Now I'm a podcaster because during many of those 45 years, I interviewed a lot of celebrities and a lot of authors and a lot of actors, singers, musicians, things like that on the radio. And so now I've archived all of them. I couldn't turn the camera and show you my archive, but it'd be messy. I got a whole wall full of boxes of tapes over here, and I've saved literally about 10,000 interviews that I did over the years, and I'm now one at a time reintroducing those to a new audience that may not have ever heard them before.
Incredible. I've been listening to your podcast, and it's just a little hidden treasure out there in the podcast universe. Just little glimpses of history. Like you look back and you're seeing all these people that maybe at the time they were marginally famous, but now they're like really big. So you'll have like Barack Obama before he was president, and Jimmy Carter, and Neil deGrasse Tyson, and all these, and Barry Goldwater, and all these just high level individuals, which is pretty amazing for me.
And actually, you've hit on something. This is one of the purposes that I wanted to set up, because many people your age only have kind of a vague recollection, perhaps, of who Barry Goldwater was. Mm-hmm. And I mean, he's very fresh in my mind because I'm an old guy, but he's very important in our country's political history. And I found when I went back to that 1987 or 88 interview I had done with him, I found out how relevant it still sounds today, given the politics of our time. And Barry Goldwater, keep in mind, he was not a rhino. he was a Republican's Republican way back in the day. And to hear him talk about how rough and tumble politics was in 1988, wow, he'd be stunned at what it's like today. But I have a lot of fun digging out those old interviews.
Yeah. A lot of these people are, especially Barry Goldwater, are people like you only hear about like in history books. Like, he was the Republican candidate against John F. Kennedy in the election of 1960. Wait, was it? It was 1960.
No, actually, against
Nixon.
Lyndon Johnson in 64.
Oh, it was
right.
It was Johnson. Yeah. Yes, it was 64. That's right.
That's right.
Yes,
and it's not, but it's not just him. I mean, I've interviewed. It occurred to me one day because somebody asked me if I've ever interviewed astronauts, and I got to thinking. You've heard of the Mercury 7, the Wright stuff, the original 7 astronauts. I've interviewed 4 of them. That's, I mean, I astound myself sometimes.
That's incredible. Yeah, so I wanted to start out here with how did you get your start in radio, and what really sparked your interest, like your development in this career?
Well, I'm by nature a pretty shy guy. I mean, what you're seeing now is not me. I'm pretty shy, but always part of me wanted an audience. It's sort of like I wanted to be heard. I wanted to be somebody that people would talk about, in the third person, like, did you hear Bill Thompson on the radio today? Yes, I did. So it turned out when I was in high school, I was a junior in high school. It turns out 2 friends of mine, we only had 2 radio stations in my little hometown, and my friend Joe worked for one of them. My friend Phil worked for the other. Well, when Joe's station had an opening, Joe said, you want to come in and try out? I said, I've never been on the radio before, but sure. And within a few days, at age 17, I had a show on the radio, a real radio station. I was playing the hits, and I thought, this is not real. This is, my gosh, I'm on the radio. People hear me. I don't know, maybe tens of people hear me. And it just went from there.
Yeah, it's interesting to see the way that radio has really evolved over the years. It's started out with we used to have all these different radio dramas and stuff like that, and nowadays it's all that
Hmm.
stuff is mostly gone into TV and now YouTube and stuff, podcasts, uh, and then
Hmm.
I would almost argue that really the end of that sort of drama and stuff like that almost ended with Prairie Home Companion, Garrison Keillor, who uh, the show still exists, but it's a changed form.
Hmm.
That's
No,
that,
you're
that
right.
old
Radio
but
has changed a lot since.
yeah.
I mean, even just since I got into it, radio has changed a lot. Corporate ownership has changed it dramatically.
Mhm.
Uh, a de-emphasis on anything local has changed it dramatically. When I got into radio back in the old days, when I got into radio, almost every radio station in America, even top 40 rock and roll stations, had fully staffed local news departments. There was a station in Chicago, a big station called WLS. And it was, oh my gosh, that was a screaming 89 WLS rock and roll. They had a news department of 7 people. And every hour of the day, they would do a full newscast at the top of the hour.
Mhm.
Now, what music stations these days even know what town they're in, let alone do local news? So it's very different.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. Now a lot of the biggest talk radio and stuff like that are people like Howard Stern. He's big. People like that. It's more national
Hmm.
stuff. NPR.
Hmm.
Mhm.
Yeah, the death of local radio is really a shame. I mean, there are some stations in some small towns across America that are automated, and they just pipe in via satellite or even via the internet, just syndicated programming, and it's like they don't even have a local audience. I mean, there was a famous story a few years ago. There was a tornado sweeping through an area, I think, of South Dakota,
Mhm.
and instead of live people getting on the air and saying, excuse me, folks, there's a tornado warning,
Mhm.
the station just kept playing the automated music. There
Yeah.
was no hint of anything. I mean, you could have been listening to a station in the Bahamas for all you knew.
Mhm.
And that's really sad.
Yeah. The next thing I wanted to ask was, so out of all these different people that you've interviewed, what's something, or it could be multiple things that you've learned from all these years of talk radio, and that that gives you the phrase, "Now I've heard everything."
Well, all right. That phrase actually came from a man who has been a long time. He's been both a boss, a mentor, a coach, a cheerleader for me. I mean, he's been all of the above. One of my favorite people in all the world. His name is Holland Cook, and he's a very he's actually on TV now on the RT network. He has his own show. But Holland Cook, a few years ago, he knew I wanted to write a book about my interviews.
Hmm.
And that's still kind of on the way back burner, but that's a whole other story. And one day I was in the studio editing something, and all of a sudden the studio door just flings open, and he says, "I know the title of your book." He says, "Now I've heard everything." I thought, yes, that's the perfect title. So I've adopted that title now for my podcast. And I guess to answer your question more directly,
Hmm.
what I've learned is that everyone, not just the famous people, because I've interviewed a lot of people you've never heard of,
Hmm.
everyone has something that is their claim to fame.
Hmm.
Somebody, for example, many years ago, I interviewed a woman, and she was an advertising executive. I guarantee you've never heard her name,
Hmm.
but she's the one who came up with the phrase, "With a name like Smuckers, it has to be good."
Yep. Yep.
I interviewed the guy who came up with. I, interviewed the guy who came up with the Coke, that red swirled line of Coke. He invented that.
Yep.
I've talked to other people who have been held prisoner in a Chinese prison camp. I interviewed an ordinary housewife from Long Island who was on vacation in Turkey and got arrested, accused of smuggling antiquities out of the country. And this nice housewife from New Jersey or Long Island or whatever suddenly finds herself in a Turkish prison.
Mhm.
I mean, really? I mean, everyone's got a story. And some of them are, and it's again, not just the celebrities, not just the famous people. Oops. Everybody has a story. Everybody has a claim to fame, and
Mhm.
the most fascinating people in the world.
Yeah. Yeah. It's
I bet
incredible.
you have a claim to fame.
Yeah, yeah. Like this show. You could say. But
Well, yeah, all right. One of the first interviews that I listened to that you've done, you did Timothy Leary's son. That
yeah,
was a good catch. I mean, that
yeah,
was a good interview.
it was a good.
And I don't know how you managed. I don't know how you did that, but that was a good catch.
I heard Zach being interviewed on a documentary that I was watching one time, and I went, I got to get that guy on. This looks really good. So I found his social media and I gave him a message. So that was a great talk they did.
Mm-hmm.
hmm And Timothy was super famous back in the '60s. With tune in, turn on, drop
Yes.
out.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm
And and
sure
and
you're aware
again,
of
that
that.
comes back to what I was saying a moment ago. I really like with Now We've Heard Everything to be able to
Mhm.
reintroduce people to those little pieces of history. I used to tell publicists, when I was trying to set up interviews with one person or another, I love people who've had just a little hand in changing some little piece of history. It doesn't mean I don't, it's great to have Jimmy Carter or Barack Obama or Al Gore or people like that
Mhm.
because they've actually changed history. But what about the lady who came up with the Smuckers logo? I interviewed the woman who invented the Barbie doll, the
Yeah.
guy who invented GI Joe. Uh,
hmm
they changed history in
hmm
their own little way. I love meeting people like that.
Yeah, a lot of these people that were so influential on like popular culture, like you said, the guy that influenced the logo for Coca-Cola, they got, their legacy
Hmm.
lived on, but
Hmm.
they themselves were lost. And so it shows like yours that bring that
Hmm.
bring that back to the popular consciousness.
And you're doing your part with yours.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Um, so another a viewer question that I had is, what's it like interviewing so many famous people, and also who was your favorite to interview all these people?
Well, the first part of that, what it's like is
Mhm,
once you get past the first couple of really famous people and you
mhm,
realize, wow, they're just people like the
mhm.
rest of us.
Yeah.
Then it's a piece of cake after that. Occasionally, I would get very starstruck.
Mhm,
And I mean, even after you've met dozens or hundreds of celebrities, there's always one that really, for me, there was, and then when you ask my favorites, one of my favorites was Captain Kangaroo,
mhm,
who was obviously a childhood hero of mine,
mhm.
and he was on Now I've Heard Everything a couple of months ago. Another one, and I'll reveal this for the first time here on your podcast. My season 3 of Now I've Heard Everything, which will be on January 4th. I will be launching season 3 with my interview from 2000. What was it? 2001, I think, with Don Knotts. Now,
Oh,
he was a childhood hero of mine.
oh,
We're
oh.
talking Deputy Sheriff Barney Fife, five-time Emmy Award winner, the star of Ghost and Mr. Chicken and The Incredible Mr. Limpet,
Yeah,
also co-star on Three's Company back in the 70s. Don Knotts was like a god to me.
Incredible Mr.
So I
Limpet's
did
good.
get a little starstruck with him. Yeah, it's once you realize now. Here's the other thing. I my two daughters who were
Mhm,
children when I was during the height of when I was doing my interviews. They're both grown and gone, and now I have grandchildren. But I used to bring my daughters with me occasionally to meet famous people. And the first couple of times they met somebody famous, like Alex Trebek, somebody like that, they were a little like, oh my gosh, oh my gosh, oh my gosh. But after they'd met a few celebrities, then they realized, okay, well, they're important and it's
mhm.
fun to meet them, but they're just people. Oop,
Yeah.
I keep hitting my microphone. They're just people like the rest of us. And the day I interviewed William Shatner one day,
Mhm,
and I brought my daughters and a friend of theirs, and this friend of theirs had never met anybody famous. So we're all sitting down in the studio, and I'm sitting here, and William Shatner's sitting next to me, and then across the table are my two daughters, who are like, "Hey, Bill, how you doing?" No, I'm not like that, but they're just but their friend who had never met a celebrity spent the whole time going,
Mhm.
she just had no conception of what it was like to meet a celebrity.
Uh-huh.
And I mean, bless her heart. I mean, a lot of people, most people probably haven't. But they're just people. I mean, maybe they've accomplished something more than other people, but in the end, they're just people like the rest of us. They have pimples, and they have itchy skin, or they have hemorrhoids, or whatever else. They get in bad moods and good moods. I've interviewed some in bad moods, and it's just they're no better, no worse than the rest of us.
Yeah. Yeah, and another question that I had was, what about Jimmy Carter? Like, was there anything specific that struck you about that interview? Or,
I actually interviewed him 3 times.
3 times?
The first time I interviewed him and Rosalind Carter together,
Oh,
and just the nicest, sweetest couple. I mean, it was like meeting my grandparents.
mm-hmm,
They were just so accommodating. So they wanted to make sure that I was comfortable. They calmed me down because I was a little nervous,
mm-hmm,
and that. And
mm-hmm,
then the next 2 times I interviewed Mr. Carter, he again was just so not. He First of all, he's also very, very smart. I mean,
mm-hmm,
he really is very
yeah,
smart, but he's also just so ordinary and down to earth in that
mm-hmm,
way that you hope he will be, and he is. Everything you've heard about him, I mean, he's 90 something years old, and he still builds houses for
mm-hmm,
Habitat for Humanity,
yeah,
and I understand why, because he's such a thoughtful and caring person,
mm-hmm,
and I really admire that about him.
mm-hmm. Oh yeah, yeah. So are there any strategies that you used to interview, like any mindset that you would place yourself in to be able to, ask better questions, or, you know, talk to these people better?
Yeah. Yes, and actually there is one very important principle, and I think, by just judging by the few minutes we've been talking, I think you understand this,
Mm-hmm,
and that is you have to listen.
mm-hmm,
My first few interviews, when I was first getting into it, I would prepare a list of questions, and I would have a clipboard, and I'd have all these questions typed out.
yeah,
And I realized I wasn't listening to the answers. I was just, all right, let's see, you've answered question number one. All right, check. Question number two, blah, 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 check. And I wasn't really listening to what the person was responding. And once I realized, okay, I'll go into an interview, I'm prepared. I mean, I know if they've written a book, I know what the book is about. Maybe I've read the book. If they're
mm-hmm,
promoting a movie or a TV show, that's what Google is for. Of
mm-hmm,
course, we didn't have Google when I was starting, but that's a whole another thing too. Uh,
yep.
but once you're prepared,
That's what newspapers
have
are for.
one question ready to launch the interview. And then once you've launched the interview, just have a conversation.
Yeah.
Again, these are just regular people, and you can ask things that maybe are on your mind. I used to frame it like, one of the hardest things is to interview somebody who's been interviewed a million times, and they've been asked everything.
Mm-hmm,
So I thought of a question one day. I started asking. I said, "Is there one question that everybody asks you that you're just so tired of hearing it, that if you could just answer it one more time, you'd never have to deal with it again? What would that question be?" And I got some really interesting answers, because it turns out, well, one of the astronauts I interviewed said that everyone always wants to know, how do you go to the bathroom in that spacesuit? He says, if I could just answer that one more time. you know. But again, coming back to your question, the
mm-hmm,
best thing is just to listen,
yeah.
and just like you and I have just having a conversation, and you're
Mm-hmm,
doing a really good job of
yeah.
listening to me, and feeding
Well,
on
thank you.
what I'm telling you. That's whether you're interviewing Jimmy Carter or Barack Obama, or years ago I had Ariel Sharon, the former
Mm-hmm,
prime minister of Israel. Oh my gosh! I
or
mean,
Bob Dole.
talk about being kind of nervous in Star Trek. He had his own bodyguards, and they had these bulging things under their jackets, which I suspect was some sort of automatic weapon. I'm not sure. And they were patrolling the hallway outside the studio as I'm interviewing him. And I'm thinking, okay, I better be very polite. But you in a case like that, I wanted to know. I said, you were a general. I said, what does it feel like to order young men, and in Israel's case, young women, into combat, knowing that some of them are not going to come back alive?
Mm-hmm.
And he thought about it, and he gave me a very thoughtful answer, which I will put in an upcoming Now I've Heard Everything podcast.
You heard it here first, folks.
That's called a teaser.
Yes. Yeah, I think I had that problem with my first interview. Is I had like you got the strict list, and you're like, I'm going to ask this and this, but then I figured out after I'm like, I should probably try to make it more conversational, and that's really what people like to listen to more, the more natural conversation, and hear that long form discussion playing out in a more natural setting. Yeah, and I think
sometimes the person you're interviewing will give you an answer. Sometimes they'll give you an answer that you hadn't anticipated, and you'll think, "Oh, wait a minute, I didn't know that's the direction we were going." That could be very interesting.
Spontaneity is really important. I think that's what so many people like about this new revolution in long form podcasting, where instead of 10-minute stuff, they can listen to podcasts can go 4 or 5 hours sometimes. Like, I'm not sure if you're aware of Dan Carlin. He's the Hardcore History. He's
heard the name, yes.
He's a fantastic storyteller. When he talks about all these different historical subjects, and famously long stuff. He started out in radio, but
well, radio is a good breeding ground.
Yeah. So I was just wondering, like, what are your thoughts on this new format of podcasting compared to radio? Like, pros, cons. Any thoughts on that?
The biggest similarity is what you and I are doing right now. Just two people having a conversation with an audience listening in. That's the most common thing. But here's where the huge difference, and this is a huge opportunity for people like you. Radio is broadcasting. It spreads its signal broadly, and you hope that with this shotgun approach, you'll find a listener here and a listener there and cobble it together into an audience. With what you're doing and what I'm doing, they've called it narrowcasting. I don't like that term, but it's essentially we are building an audience that will listen just to us. I mean, we're not part of a radio station. We're not part of a network. We're not putting a signal out there to the whole world, hoping that somebody in their car will accidentally tune into us. Our listeners, the audience, as measured by radio standards, might look small, but if you have 10,000 listeners, by radio station standards, my gosh, you'd be canceled the next day because that's a really tiny audience by radio standards. But by podcasting standards, you're a star if you have 10,000 listeners. And that's the big difference. And I think that's going to enable a lot of people who are really talented but could never get that, for whatever reason, could never get that broad audience on radio. Now they have a chance to really shine in their own little niche in podcasting.
And a little bit, podcasting is a little bit like pirate radio. Like, it's so democratized. Anybody can start a podcast, and they can just record whatever they want to talk about. Have anybody on the show that they want, and anybody in the world can listen to.
Stop hitting my microphone.
Yeah.
Yeah, actually, on TikTok, because TikTok is kind of a podcast in a way. It's kind of a hybrid between
1 minute
broadcasting and narrowcasting. 1 minute at a time. But it turned out, I looked at my analytics one day on my TikTok account, and by golly, I got several tens of thousands of listeners in Norway.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah. So. Yeah, that's the other thing I wanted to talk. that's the other thing I wanted to talk about is, how has you're obviously very present on TikTok. How has this changed the way that you've presented yourself, professionally? Like, obviously, it's a change from.
I had only been on TikTok for I had only been on TikTok for a couple of months when I saw a video produced by a young woman that randomly popped up on my For You page,
Mhm.
and she clarified things in my mind so clearly in that moment. In less than 1 minute, in less than 60 seconds, she kind of gently scolded her TikTok followers and said, it's not about the numbers. She says, it's not about how many followers you're going to get or how many likes you're going to get or things like that. She says, it's about what makes you happy and satisfied.
Mhm.
That's why you post on TikTok. And at that moment, I realized she is totally right. And so, to answer your question, that's how TikTok really has changed what I do. Because for many, many years, for almost 45 years I was in broadcasting, I had a program director or a news director kind of steering me to do this or do that, or say this or say that, or say it this way, or say it that way, because the audience research had said that's what we should do.
Mhm.
And not that I couldn't do what I wanted to do. I could still kind of put my stamp on it, but it wasn't until TikTok that I could really be me.
Yeah.
And they always say be authentic. Well, I guess I never really knew exactly what that meant until TikTok. Now I can be authentic, and I can do, which is now I brought that philosophy to my podcast. Now I've heard everything, available on all major podcast platforms, uh, and I do what I want to do. I
Mhm.
put the interviews on that I want to put on, and I
Mhm.
present them, and let the audience chips fall where they may. And I'm having a blast doing it.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel like in any online platforms, the most successful people are the ones that are just doing whatever makes them happy, whatever doing top, like if on a
Hmm.
podcast talking about what they're interested in, on TikTok just doing fun stuff. So of course, the most
Hmm.
popular podcast in the world right now is Joe Rogan, and one of the things that makes him so popular is he just
Hmm.
talks about whatever interests him. He'll bring on scientists
Hmm.
and comedians. He's into mixed martial arts, so you bring on those people, and people just bring on whatever interests them.
Hmm. Yeah. And the world is a very rich place if you start exploring. There's another phrase that I hate, but it's kind of appropriate. Get outside your comfort zone. I
Hmm.
mean, each of us tends to get into a little bit of a rut, a little bit of a comfort zone. And when I was doing interviews with celebrities or authors and things like that over the years, excuse me, um, it forced me to, well, in many cases, to read a book that I never would have even looked at in the bookstore if it hadn't been that I was about to do the interview.
Yeah.
And I met the most fascinating people. I learned more about, how oil is discovered and drilled for. I learned about undersea, explorations. I learned about politics. I learned about, the governance of, the Seychelles Islands and things. All this stuff I never would have thought to go and look up on my own, outside my comfort zone.
Yep. Yep. S- are there any guests that you had on your show that really surprised you? Like maybe because they were not at all what you expected them to be like, or uh, maybe or maybe they said something that surprised you, or something of the sort.
There was one, and one, well, there were many, but there was one that really stands out. And people ask me this a lot, about somebody who has surprised me.
Hmm.
And again, this is an interview I featured recently on Now I've Heard Everything.
Hmm.
David Cassidy, who
Hmm.
your older listeners may recognize as the teen idol from the 70s, the Partridge Family.
Hmm.
Oh, he was big. He was a mega star.
Hmm.
I interviewed him. He was about, I guess he would have been about 42, 43, 44 years old at the time I interviewed him, long past his his prime as a teen idol.
Yeah.
And he was one of the most thoughtful and retrospective and self-examining and just out, just, here I am, I'm a genuine person kind of interviews. I really, I was blown away by
Hmm.
what a great man he was. Now, I say great in terms, I mean, he wasn't a great statesman or anything like that, didn't do, sign treaties and things and of course he had all the usual 70s problems, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. But he was a great man in the sense that he knew who he was and he knew what his boundaries were. He knew what his faults were, and he was willing to admit those, look them in the eye, and face them and overcome them. And I thought, this is wonderful. But it also, it occurred to me, as I even said to him during the interview, I said, if we'd been talking 20 years ago, you would have arrived here probably in a secret entrance with a phalanx of bodyguards to protect you from the screaming mobs of teenage girls. And he said, you're right, he says, and I was a different person then.
Yeah.
I thought, oh, wow. That's just so, I mean, that interview, I did that interview 25 years ago, and it still sticks with me to this day, what a terrific guy he was.
Well, I feel like that sounds a lot like, in more modern times, someone like Matthew McConaughey, who, normally you see him as just the actor that goes, all right, all right, all right. But then you start listening to him appearing on these podcasts now, and, he's a very deep person who's, he's traveled all over the world, and he's very, very profound, he's a lot of very interesting person.
And I have to mention, right. And I have to mention one other person who has unfortunately suffered from one of those public kind of perceptions that he's kind of dumb and not real bright. Dan Quayle, our former vice president, who sadly through a couple of accidental misspeaks a couple of times, people were convinced he was a lighthead. He was just no brain. I've interviewed him a couple of times. He is brilliant. I mean, he is a great thinker, very articulate, more so in print than he is in spoken. I think, honestly, there's a little bit of a wiring short circuit between his brain and his mouth, because he sometimes will stumble over a simple phrase or something, but his thinking is flawless. He's really, and it kind of, and the other thing, like David Cassidy, he's very honest about it. He knows what his reputation is. He even plays into it, with some humor. But it's people like that who really I find very inspirational, as opposed to the people who come in and they try to maintain this public persona and there's one author in particular. I will not mention this author's name. He is a very famous author of many best-selling books, who comes in and he sits down and his very posture basically says, I dare you to interview me. Really?
So you say that's probably the most negative experience you've had interviewing someone? Is that author?
Let's put it this way. This particular author, he's been so rude to so many interviewers that here's the question. I get people will say to me, who's the rudest person you've ever interviewed? And before I can even answer, they say, was it, and they mention his name. Yeah, that's who it was.
Famously rude in interviews.
Very, very much so.
Yeah. Going back to the Dan Quayle thing, it's kind of interesting how, like, with public figures like that, like they could have like a very successful, political career, and all of a sudden, like a couple lines, and all of a sudden it's ruined. Like someone like Howard Dean, who, like, during that famous speech, he was getting real worked up, and all of a sudden he just decides to do a last and then all of a sudden completely ruined. But then when they asked people that were there, they never noticed it. The people in the crowd, when they asked people on TV, they all noticed it, because the cameras are zoomed in on them, you can see everything.
I remember that in real time. I watched that happen, and at the time I thought, oh, okay, he's just excited. And even the next day, 2 days later, after the controversy started, I'm thinking, what's the big deal? He's excited. He's full of vigor. I mean, that's what I want in a, not that I would have eventually voted for him. I don't know, who knew, because the campaign was still early at that point. But my gosh, I thought, what what a refreshing change that was from the
Mhm.
usual sedate. Oh yes, we've won in New Hampshire. Now we plan to go to Iowa. Thank you to all my
Mhm.
supporters. Blah, blah, blah.
Mhm. Yeah, he had fire. He had fire in his campaign.
Mhm.
Um, what do you have any advice that you would give to someone that's wanting to pursue, a similar career in, radio or podcasting or anything?
Whenever somebody asks me if I can give them advice on how to get into radio,
Mhm.
I have to be cautious with my answer because it is such a changed landscape now compared to
Mhm.
when I got in. If I gave people advice on how to get into radio the way I got in, they would never get in
Yeah.
because it just doesn't work that way anymore.
Mhm.
Uh,
It's more by chance.
I got in 1973 at a, like I said, yeah, I got in at a very small station in a very small town. And what you did in those days was you got that small station, then you worked your way up to a medium-sized station, then you worked your way up to a little bit bigger station in a bigger city, and kept going until you reached one of the top 10 markets, which
Mhm.
is essentially what my career path was. These days, as likely as not, you could walk into a top 10 station right now and theoretically get an on-air job. Now,
Mhm.
I don't want to raise anybody's hopes up because that still rarely happens. But in other words, we've kind of bypassed the small stations because, as I was alluding to a few minutes ago, so many of those small stations now are automated, they're corporate owned, they have no local presence at all. Many of them don't, many of them literally don't have any live on air disc jockeys. All they have is canned or syndicated programming. And your chances of getting a job there, you might get a job there, maybe as a janitor. But to break into on air, you're probably going to have to go to at least a medium sized market,
Mhm.
which would define maybe as Tulsa, Phoenix. Well, actually, Phoenix is going to be a bigger market, but
Mhm.
maybe Topeka,
Yep.
or someplace like that. As opposed to, I spent most of my career in Washington D.C. Or in Boston, places like that. You can get it. I know people who have made their on-air debut at a station in Washington D.C. Now
Mhm.
that's when I got into radio, that was extremely rare. But these days, that's that's almost the only place that will still hire
Mhm.
somebody new. So I'm giving you a very long answer to your very, very short and
It's
succinct
okay.
question. But it's the essential rule is you have to get your foot in the door one way or another. Even if it's a small station that
Mhm.
only has one or two live personalities, get your foot in the door and maybe be a janitor, maybe answer the phones,
Mhm.
maybe, because every station needs somebody to do the little menial tasks. Make friends at the station, especially friends who are in a position to help you advance up. Make an audition. Now, in my day, we made reels of tape or cassettes. These days, you'll probably put together an MP3 of some of your, if you want to be a disc jockey, show how you can be a disc jockey. If you want to be a news person, do a fake newscast. If you want to be a talk show host, do a quick podcast, like just a 2 or 3 minute little MP3 that you can send to the program director of whatever station you want to be with, and say, "Here's what I could do. What kind of opportunities are there? Maybe here, maybe at another station, maybe at another town."
Mhm.
Again, when my career was building, you moved a lot because you had to move. I went from the small town in northern Illinois to a little bit bigger station in Champaign, Urbana when I was at the University of Illinois.
Yep.
Went from there to Tulsa, Oklahoma, to a bigger station in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Then I became a news director in Charleston, South Carolina.
Mhm.
Then I became a news director in Providence, Rhode Island, worked part time at a station in Boston, and then from there moved to Washington, D.C. I did all of that in a span of 6 years.
Mhm.
So, I mean, it can move. It keep you're going to keep U-Haul in business, for a little while, but eventually you can. It is still possible to become, for a newcomer to become quite a big personality in local radio.
Mhm. Yeah. Also, have there been any very important people like in your career, like whether it could be a guest that was very important, or anybody that's really impacted your radio, your show?
Well, the man that I mentioned a few minutes ago who came up with the title, Now I've Heard Everything, my friend
Mhm.
Holland Cook,
Mhm.
he is a giant in radio. I mean, he has been for, wow, probably almost 50 years now. He started as a disc jockey and worked his way up and became program director, then a
Mhm.
program consultant, and then now he's a TV talk show host
Mhm.
and things like this. He's had a varied career, and he's just and his birthday is next week. Happy birthday, Holland, if you're listening. And but everybody needs somebody like that. And that kind of goes to your previous question too, as to how to get in. Find somebody who can be a mentor. Find somebody who's been in the business for more than a year or two. You need somebody who's been around, who knows the business a little bit and can help steer you toward or away from one opportunity or another. One thing Holland has done for me over the years is he has not only steered me toward things that he knew would be good for me, he's kind of gently nudged me away from the things he knew would not be a good career move for me, or
Mhm.
things that wouldn't be a good fit. And you need somebody like that.
Mhm. Um, Another question I had was, this is a bit of an odd question. What's a question that I haven't asked that you would have liked to be asked, if you could think of one?
That is actually a great question. I tell you, I learned this very early on when I was interviewing
Mhm.
celebrities and big names. Very often, I realized as we were walking out of the studio and I saw them tucking their 3x5 cards back in their jacket pocket, they'd be saying, "Gee, I sure wish you'd asked me about blah, 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 blah." And it occurred to me, as smart as I am, I can't come up with every question that they might have wanted to be asked.
Mhm.
So I started asking at the end of every interview. I would say, "Hey, look, I'm just about out of time, but is there anything else that you wanted to add or any question you wanted me to ask you that I didn't
Mhm.
already ask you?" And usually I'd get, "No, you did a pretty good job, Bill," or "No, you're fine."
Mhm.
But every now and then, probably about one interview out of every four, I would get what we would now call the money quote,
Ooh,
the
ooh.
sound bite of the interview in that last question, because they had come to the studio prepared to answer something that it hadn't occurred to me to ask.
Mhm.
And so you're asking that question. That is the money question. I mean,
Mhm.
always, if you're able to, if it's not a, I can't imagine a situation where you couldn't ask it, but as long as you're able to, always ask at the end of an interview, what didn't I ask you that you wanted to be asked? What have I
Mhm.
left out? That
Mhm.
is a great, great question.
Mhm. So what is the question that you wanted to be asked, if there is one?
uh, I'll tell you what, I will give you the answer that most people gave me, and that
Mhm.
is, you've really done a good job. And I can't think of anything really that I should have talked about that you didn't ask me about, because you've asked the right questions.
Okay, well, thank you.
Let me ask you a question.
Okay.
Let me ask you a question. Where is your podcast going? I mean, where do you see it a year from now? What is your long-term picture for your podcast?
Ooh, that's a that's a good question. Hmm. Well, I picture really growing it out, trying to get,
Maybe I've given you something to think about this week.
yeah, try to get it out to not just American listeners, which is the majority, but get it out to more international, which I have some. Um, Nico, if you're listening to this, um, um, in France. But yeah, I suppose that's an interesting question.
Mhm.
I suppose it'd be that.
It really does help focus things if you stop it, because I do this pretty much on an annual basis, usually around the end of the year now, especially now with my podcast as I'm wrapping up season 2, about to head into season 3. I'm thinking, all right, where am I going with this? I mean, it's sort of like if you're on a road trip, you pause, you pull over to the side of the road for a minute, recheck
Mhm.
your map and say, all right, am I still headed to where I want to be going?
Mhm.
And maybe you'll change course slightly. Maybe you'll change your theme song for your podcast. Maybe
Yeah.
you'll change the name of the podcast. Maybe you'll change your profile picture.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe you'll add some new Google, advertising strategy. Maybe you'll do something else. Something. Maybe you'll just have in mind, all right, I would like to interview this person, this person, this person, this person in the coming year. Whatever it is, it helps to refine, keep it sharp and keep it in focus, and just re-examine where it is you're going. Now, from the episodes that I've seen on your podcast, you've got a great foundation,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
you're heading in clearly in the right direction. So I would keep doing what you're doing, but in your mind, and don't listen to anybody say you should do this, you should do that. No, do what you want to do. Be authentic, like we were saying a moment ago, and you'll go places.
Yeah. Yeah. I suppose. Well, probably just try to branch out and get even more guests on that I want to get on. Maybe change my strategy to try to attract more people on. Yeah. So you mentioned earlier that you were thinking. What was that?
No, I was just going to say you can build on your success now when you go to a publicist who's representing some musician that you want to interview. You can say, well, I've done interviews with this person, this person, this person, this person, and you listen to those podcasts, see what I can do, because they always want to know, all right, first of all, they want to know if you're going to be for real. Are you going to ask dumb questions, or are you a good interviewer? And you're a good interviewer. Second thing they're going to want to know is who's your audience, how big your audience is, what's the reach, how's it going to help us, if I let you interview this person that I represent. But the more of those you can convince, it literally is a ladder, and you go up the ladder, and eventually you'll get to, I didn't start by interviewing Jimmy Carter and Barack Obama and, Kirk Douglas and Charlton Heston and all that.
Yeah.
I started by interviewing people you've never heard of. and once the publicists, once they get the gatekeepers, once they understand you're for real and that you're serious and you're a good interviewer, and especially if the people you've interviewed have gone back to their publicists and said, hey, that Chris Wright, he's really good. You should book more people with him.
Yeah.
That's how it works.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Another thing that I've been planning to do is as I was planning on recording a few, radio plays, that sort of thing, to put on the podcast, which would be pretty fun to do. So I'm working on that a little bit. And you mentioned earlier that you had considered writing a book.
Are you?
What was that? Am I what? Am I what?
No, I was just going to ask you: Are you collaborating with other podcasters? I mean, are you doing, like, in terms of a radio play, or doing maybe something where you're doing one part and they're doing another part? Maybe you even have a third person doing a third part, and then somebody assembles it all together. That'd be very cool.
Yeah. I collaborate with Shakrut, the podcast of cultural differences. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So I have I know the hosts over there, so. So
okay.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier that you were thinking of writing a book called "Now I've Heard Everything." So what plans do you have for that, or what's that going to be about?
That too is something, because the book publishing business has changed almost as much as the radio industry has. And when I was first shopping that book around to publishers, that was literally 20 years ago. It was back in 1999, 2000, somewhere around there. And I actually had a couple of publishers who were interested, but ultimately they said no to me because I wasn't big enough. I wasn't a well enough known name, which, from their point of view, makes sense. I mean, I had, a good sized audience, but I was large. I wasn't a Howard Stern or a Rush Limbaugh or somebody with a big marketable name.
Yeah.
Since then, the publishing landscape has changed a lot. And now, to be honest, if I were, my plans for a book are way on the back burner. I mean, the podcasting is my focus right now. But if I do a book, it will probably be a self-published multimedia book where you would have text and photos and maybe even some videos and a lot of audio. And it would be very interactive. So again, that's going to be a lot of, probably if I transcribed or had somebody transcribe all my interviews, that could make a reasonably marketable book. But boy, you talk about labor intensive. That's, I've tried transcribing interviews. It's a pain. It really is.
Yeah.
Plus, it loses something. I mean, to read something that Dolly Parton said is one thing, but to hear Dolly Parton say it with that little giggle that she has is something entirely different.
You lose
And
the emotion.
that's why I would have to do a multimedia book.
You lose the emotion and the
Yeah,
inflection.
Yeah, exactly. And even the most articulate people, when you transcribe their exact words, they come out sounding kind of ordinary. I mean, because very few people speak in quotations, maybe like Mark Twain did. But I've interviewed a couple of those people, actually. It's remarkable when you find somebody like that. But 99% of people, again, coming back to what I said a moment ago, they're just ordinary people, and they talk like ordinary people talk in incomplete sentences without much punctuation and skipping freely from one topic to the next. And it just doesn't come across well.
Yeah, with the possible exception of Neil deGrasse Tyson, who seems like whatever he says is always super profound, and
Yes.
it's always very quote worthy.
Yes. And right. And another one who was that way was Andrew Young, who was, you may remember, the former ambassador to the United Nations, former congressman, former mayor of Atlanta. And what few people remember is that he was also a very close confidant of Martin Luther King Jr.
Wow.
And in fact, Andrew Young was alongside Martin Luther King when King was assassinated in Memphis. Andrew Young was one of the people on the balcony at the Lorraine Motel when the shot rang out that killed Martin Luther King. And Andrew Young he is just a remarkable, intelligent doesn't go far enough to describe Andrew Young. He was just, you talk about somebody who speaks in quotations, Andrew Young, no doubt. It was a life-changing interview.
Yeah. So, have you considered doing any more new interviews via your podcast, or is it mostly going to be old clips from the radio days?
Well, as much as I like my archive, and I love my archive because I've got literally thousands more interviews that I could choose from. It's kind of hard to choose which ones I'm going to put. It's like picking which of your children are your favorites. But actually, it's interesting you would ask me that, and this is another piece of news I'm making on your podcast. I've not revealed this publicly yet, but I am, in fact, thinking about doing some fresh interviews again because I kind of miss it. Do you have dreams about things that you wish for? I mean, or things that you miss doing? I keep having recurring dreams of interviewing, and in my dreams, I've met people I've never met or interviewed in real life. I've met the Queen of England. I've met Jonathan Winters. I've met Steve Martin in my dreams because it's like I want to start interviewing again. So I'm not making an official announcement, but I will give you the partial scoop. I am thinking about perhaps later in 2021 resuming a light schedule of a few selected like big either celebrity or at least big. Who I'd really like to interview is Anthony Rizzo of the Cubs. He's my favorite Cub.
Okay, wow, that'd be a good one.
So it would be people like that. I mean, again, doing what I want to do. And I'm not, I've done a lot of interviews over the years, maybe as a favor to a publicist because they got me somebody good. So I owe them a favor. So I'll interview this person I've never heard of. I enjoyed it, but I probably wouldn't have chosen that person. But if I'd start doing fresh interviews again, I probably will only do the ones that I really want to do. And so maybe one or two a month, maybe instead of the 4 or 5 a day I used to do back in the day.
Oof, that's a heavy schedule right there.
Yes. But it also made for some very interesting juxtapositions. There was one day in, I think it was September of 1994. In one day, I started the day with the aforementioned Dolly Parton,
Hmm.
Then later in the day, I had George Takei,
Okay.
for the Mr. Sulu from Star Trek, and now
Hmm.
he's the famous internet presence in his own right.
Hmm.
And then I closed out the day with, are you ready for this? Audrey Meadows, who played Alice Cramden on The Honeymooners back in the 1950s. So
Hmm.
in one day, Dolly Parton and George Takei and Audrey Meadows all in one day.
What a day.
you know, yeah, that kind of day was not uncommon for me,
Hmm.
and I had a blast.
Hmm.
Wonderful. That's why I say my archive. I have I have so much I want to so much I want to share.
Hmm. Do you still keep in touch with any of these people, or?
There are some people that I do. There are some people that I'm friends on Facebook with, so we
Hmm.
exchange greetings from time to time. There's only maybe one or two fairly well-known people with whom I'm in frequent touch.
Hmm.
One of whom is the author slash TV producer Brad Meltzer,
Okay.
who you may know from the political thrillers that he writes, and he
Hmm.
also has he was behind that TV show a few years ago. What was it, Bobby and it was a show about the Kennedys, I guess, or something like that.
Hmm.
And then he also has some sort of, I forget what the name of it is. I really should know this. He has like an unsolved mysteries kind of show, historical mysteries. But Brad is, oh my gosh, Brad is one of the sweetest guys in the world,
Hmm.
and he never fails to ask about my wife and our kids and things like that.
Yeah.
Just a very nice guy.
Yeah. So I think that's about all I have for today. Maybe someday in 40 years I'll take some of my old recordings and I'll make, and whatever replaces podcasts, I'll put them onto that new form. And I'll call it
I think it's going to be holograms.
I'll call it Now I've Heard Everything Twice. Um,
There you go. There you
yeah.
go.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So.
no, I definitely would encourage you to save everything, because
Mhm.
I don't know what possessed me to start saving things way back in the 1980s when I started this, but I'm glad
Mhm.
I did. So I would,
Mhm.
same advice to you, save, especially now when you save everything just on a thumb drive. You can save a year's worth of interviews on a single USB drive. Do it. I mean, there's no reason to throw anything away these days.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, yeah. It'll it'll be fun. So, just to end up, where can people find you if they wanna learn more?
My website that goes along with the podcast, my website is heardeverything.com. And I chose that because I wasn't sure if people would think to put in the apostrophe in I've.
Mhm.
So instead of Now I've Heard Everything, I just chose heardeverything.com.
Mhm.
The podcast, which is available on all major podcast platforms, is Now I've Heard Everything. If you go to, say, the Apple Podcast or Google Podcast or Spotify or any of those, and you search for Now I've Heard Everything, it'll be right there. And I would encourage your listeners to at least try it out, see if see if there's somebody on there that you like. This coming week, the week of December 14th, Graham Nash, Kitty Carlisle, who your older listeners may remember from back in the day on To Tell the Truth and things like that.
Mhm.
Also, she was in a Marx Brothers movie. She tells great stories in this interview about Groucho Marx, working with him.
Mhm.
And then on Friday this coming week, a guy by the name of Egil Krog. Egil Krog, you may not remember, but Egil Krog was a lower level staffer in the Nixon White House.
Yeah.
Egil Krog was there the day that Elvis Presley just randomly showed up at the White House and wanted to meet the president.
Yeah.
And the most surreal scene of Elvis Presley shaking hands with Richard Nixon in the Oval Office. So Egil Krog was there, and he wrote a book about it, and I interviewed him. So he'll be on Now I've Heard Everything this week. Anyway, was that a really nice promo for my show, or what?
That was a great promo. Yeah. So I highly recommend your show, even if you just listen to people that you know, but I recommend that you listen to people that you don't know, because then you'll learn something, and then you'll know everything.
Well,
Yep.
at least you'll be entertained for 15
Yeah.
minutes.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. And also, you can be found on TikTok.
My TikTok name is Heard Everything.
Yep. Okay, so now it is time to bid adieu to Bill Thompson. It's been a pleasure having you on the show.
Chris, the pleasure has been all mine. You are a terrific interviewer, and I wish you great success.
Thank you. Thank you. So I am Chris Wright. You're watching Point Counterpoint.